Welcome back, everybody. This is Kyle with Pushing Buttons, and today Kevin is MIA, but stepping in his shoes in his place is Frank.
Hey y'all, how you doing?
Welcome back again. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And how you doing? How you doing this week?
I'm doing great. I feel like this is like like Dad's out of the house. We're gonna have some fun. Like this is like how there's like you get like a remaster version of a game and it's like it's got better graphics and better sound, but maybe not as classic, not as good as the original, but you're still having fun. That's what we got here, guys. This is like the remaster version. No Kevin, we're off the rails, which is a great
You
phrase
know,
for what we're talking about today.
yeah, we'll see how this goes. We're gonna try something new this week. We're gonna call this our button pusher. Now, this is a new thing that I just kind of came up with on a whim,
hmm
and Frank loved the idea. And basically, we're going to take a topic, or in this case, two different types of games, and pit them against each other. We're going to have myself representing linear games and their strengths, while Frank is going to be representing open world games
Yeah,
and their strengths. And then we're going to try and counteract each other, and try our best anyway to push each other's buttons.
there we
I
go.
think we're missing that in the show, and we need more of it. So
Hashtag
I'm happy
open
to
world
test this
games,
with you.
guys. Come on, vote for me.
There you go. Yeah. If you have an
You know
opinion,
what?
share it
Yeah,
in our
we'll do a
comment
poll on
section.
Twitter. God damn it! Why don't we think about this shit more
Yes.
often? Poll on Twitter. I'm writing it down right now. It's happening.
Very good. Very good. And I know Kevin would be on the side of linear games alongside me. So I think this is the great method of trying this out with Frank
Yeah,
repping open world. But
I would
speak,
always represent open world, dude. I was hoping when we were asking like which one, I was like, which one did you take? He said linear. I'm like, sweet. I don't have to make up shit. I actually do care about open world games. It's perfect.
and I think to kind of get the wheels turning a little bit, let's just kind of start by discussing our favorite games in each side. So, for
Yeah,
example, I'll start off with linear. For me, I enjoy games that are like focused on story as well as having a shorter length because I feel like for myself anyway, my time is important. It's getting more important with each passing year.
yeah,
We're getting old here at Geek Freaks Network, so we
we
gotta
really are. Yeah,
make our time count.
yeah,
And this goes back to a lot of the third rail action shooters like I've loved playing over the years. So this includes like Resident Evil 4, 5, and not so much 6, but 4 and 5 are pretty good. And like the Dead Space series, as well as other shooters like Shadows of the Damned or Uncharted, stuff like that, where it's kind of like an action focused 10 to 20 hours, good pacing.
yeah. Like the early God of
And I'll
Wars are
start off with
that
that.
way too.
Indeed.
And I also want to make sure we talk about that too. Games that were open world or on rails and switch to the other side. Yeah, and then we'll discuss also the some of the keystones of those genres. But yeah, for open world games, great examples here are Red Dead Redemption, Grand Theft Auto, Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, Spider Man, which is coming to PC, folks. We talked about that on Geek Freaks. Check that out. Um, and some of the hallmarks for an open world game are they have great story, but generally they are pushing exploration in games. So it's all about immersing you in a world and giving you a world to explore, and then you unlock the story the more you explore, or you're at least rewarded for your exploration. So sometimes it's in bettering your armor. A lot of genres that lean in on this is RPGs are really big in open world. Um, Obviously MMOs, but I'm gonna try to not talk about MMOs, which is gonna put a little. I'm giving myself a little bit of a handicap. If you played golf, you know what that means. That's what I'm doing. So I'm not gonna talk about MMOs today. Um, but yeah, so they really lean on exploration, but they can be very formulaic very quickly, as we've seen with certain games like Far Cry, where it's like, okay, yeah, you discover a new area, you do this on the map. So it's hard to do an open world game without falling into a formula that's already been established or one that you find that's successful and you're like, oh yeah, let's keep carrying with this. We've seen certain companies do that. So, but yeah, I mean, you could get great stories in open world too. Red Dead Redemption is arguably one of the best stories in gaming, and open world game, one of the best.
So now that we've kind of established like what we find particularly enjoyable about each type of game, now we're gonna argue against each other and see, what we can attain from that debate.
Yeah.
So I'll open this up by, mentioning first what I think linear games do a lot better than open world is it sets the player down in a focal point, like first person, third person, and it creates an experience more so than a world. And it's kind of like a Disney theme park ride in
Right.
a way, where you just, get immersed in the game for a short little bit and you just enjoy the heck out of being immersed in that environment. One of the most immersive rides I've ever been a part of was the Pirates of the Caribbean at Disneyland. Like I
So
thought that
good.
was incredible for what it was.
Yeah.
There's voice acting and animatronics and a lot of action. And I would argue that linear games are very similar to that. We have a lot of set pieces. Like Uncharted is a great example of this. You have epic scenes like in Uncharted 2 with the train at the beginning of the game,
Yeah.
and then Uncharted 3 with the airplane, and you're falling out the back of it, trying to hold on for dear life. And the building collapse, I think, in Uncharted 2 as well, and all the chase scenes in Uncharted 4, and the games like that. It's really hard to, I think, transfer that kind of action into an open world game because of not only the engine of the game that it's developed in, but also because you are allowed to devote more resources into making those set pieces even more vibrant and more memorable. And that includes all sorts of other aspects. But I'll start with that.
All right. Well, here's how you're wrong, Kyle. So, yes, Disneyland's a great example. Actually, that is perfect example. The player is forced to look in a certain direction so they can make that direction as pretty as possible. I'm gonna compare it to a zoo. Okay, so yes, in a zoo you could go around and you're like, look, here's a lion. He's right there in front of you. But we know that that's not really how things are supposed to be done. If you're out in the savannah where there's actual lions, then you increase the nervousness, the tensity. You're in the world with the creature you're fighting. When in linear games, you and I have both experienced this, I'm sure. You're playing the game and all of a sudden you're like, oh, this path is going into a wider open area. Well, I know that means I'm about to fight something big, and it's formulaic in a way that's kind of like, okay, I watch his rotation and I can counter it and I'm good. And then I just see that there's one opening that I haven't been through yet, so I must go that way to progress. So it becomes so on the rails that it pulls you out of the game and pulls you into the development of the game. You see which way they want you to point. Half the time nowadays, games actually lock the camera and force you to look in a certain direction because, like, look, we spent a lot of money on this particular direction, so go look in this way. Um, and that could feel like I'm playing a game and I know how that's being made and it's not as great. But in an open world game, you could actually explore the certain areas. You'll find those shots naturally. So think about it again in the zoo. You're walking around, you see a lion, that's cool. Yeah, it's neat. It's in a zoo. But when I mean, it's not great, it's in a zoo, whatever. But when you're in the open world, you come across a lion, your heart starts to race. Does it see me? I see it. Can I sneak around this lion? The lion's attacking something else. This is what the natural lion will do. It creates an environment that's much more, feelings driven, and has a reaction out of the human more so than in a zoo. And I think open worlds can capture something that, what you're explaining with on rails is a movie, and you're pressing buttons to make the movie keep going. But in open world, you're actually discovering the story, and it immerses you more in it. That's my defense.
No, that was great. I think I do agree with you on some points. I feel like there are moments in open world games where you come across something. Like I always remember the cougars in Red Dead Redemption 2,
Yes.
and there was a cave of some of them, and there was like a guy who was dead outside of it, so it kind of
Mhm.
gave you that tension
Yeah.
before you even got into the cave. And that is one of its strengths, is that you can come across a situation that you have no idea, no preparation for. But then again, that's what I think is a drawback of open world, because for the main story or the main campaign of the game, I felt like Red Dead 2, there were moments in the story that I lost kind of interest, and I moved out into the open world to make my own story. And I feel like with linear games, you can't do that as much. But then again, that allows the developer to craft like a really excellent story with, good writing, good visuals, and deliver on voice acting as well.
Yeah, you just
And
argued for me though, in a lot of ways in that sense. You ran out of main story, so you made your own story, which means you were living in that world, i.e., escaping your current world, which is the point of entertainment and video games in general. Like you actually made the game yours, and you found that cave, and the developer put that dead body out there to kind of say like, careful. So there was a hint, and
yeah,
which way is, I mean, could be seen as some sort of a rail, but nevertheless, you just you made that game better, and that's something that can't be done in a linear game.
there are some aspects of linear games where you can like uh I guess vocalize your choices as a player that are significant.
Yeah,
So I would argue games like Demon Souls or Dark Souls, you can't really classify those as open world. I would say they're more linear based,
right.
especially Demon Souls. And with the gameplay, you can experiment in a lot of different ways. You can choose what weapon you wish to use or what stats you wish to upgrade. And I know this isn't strictly tied to linear, but in a linear experience, you feel that power of progression even more, I would say, than you would in an open world game.
Feel like it's
Because,
forced though. That power of progression is forced because it's like I have a checkpoint, and basically, like if you're thinking like Mario, to get to 1-2, you have to get the flag in 1-1. And I think linear games are forcing you so hard into that pathway that the progression doesn't feel like I earned it. It's just that I'm at that point now to where progression happens. Do you feel, can you like, do you understand what I'm saying? Like Hades is that way too. Hades is an amazing game. And as you die, you get farther and farther in the game. But because, I mean, that's a roguelike. Well, to a degree it is, but you recognize maps. But it's like if I just keep hitting my head against this wall, eventually I get enough unlocks to where I will mow the shit down in the beginning to eventually progress. So it doesn't feel like I've earned it as much as I just kept playing enough, you know.
with linear, I think the tools that you're given at the beginning of the game, they're very limited, and there's like usually a story element tied to that
Yeah.
reason. But over the course of the game, you do feel the impact of your progress more than an open world game. Because I think in an open world game, typically with like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead, you don't really see a huge increase in variety in regards to enemy design. And you kind of get accustomed to that same rotation of gameplay over and over. And that is true for linear as well. But I would argue because of the constraints within that campaign, you do feel that progression even further because you can, say, upgrade your weapons to have new effects, or even in certain cases, your character. Again, this goes back to a lot of shooter based games where you can upgrade your stats and get more health or get more armor, get more, magic or psychic power or whatever,
Yeah.
and upgrade the damage of your weapons over time.
Now, it's hard with Rockstar games because specifically with those two that you mentioned, you're what they do instead of like making the bosses harder, if that makes sense, like your enemies are not harder, it's just more of them. So if you guys are familiar with like the end of a Grand Theft Auto game, generally there's a situation where you have to like defend a spot and they bring 150 people out at you. Or if anything, your wanted levels up really high, then yeah, the boss is actually harder. Uh, Red Dead does the same thing. It's the same company. But if you look at a game like, let's say, Horizon Forbidden West, the game actually does get harder, and you do feel the benefit because the environment you're discovering is has bigger and better bosses. Like if you were to somehow, and you can, which is the best part of open world games. Horizon has a little bit of a gate system, so it's closer to a hybrid, but nevertheless, we're going to use this as an open world in this case. You can walk your butt out there all the way to the end of the game, and I mean everybody's seen Breath of the Wild in these cases. You'll get nuked. I mean, you won't survive. Elden Ring is a game built on this now at this point. Everybody's speed running it to see how soon can they get out to the hardest spots. Now, you do naturally have a progression system in that game, and the fact that I know the more prepared I am, the more likely I am to down that last guy. And I think in a lot of ways, that's the linear aspect of an open world game, is knowing that the most optimal route, which, we don't necessarily want to talk about optimal routes because that's not as fun as exploration, but optimal routes, like this guy, then this guy, then this guy, I get health, rapid fire on my arrows, whatever, and then I can head right out and take out whomever. That's the linear route within an open world game. But I think that, you know, bigger and better bosses definitely happen in open world games. It's just that it feels more natural. That being said, in general, games have a problem where you upgrade your abilities, but then the bosses upgrade so that you feel like you're still having just as much of a hard time. That's a problem with just video games in general. Like, how do you tell that story outside of an RPG? You really can't. Basically your abilities just look flashier, but you're still taking 12 seconds. The combat timer is supposed to be 12 seconds for most games. That's what they're shooting for. And so, yeah, generally, like, yeah, I do a cool new move now, but it still took you 12 seconds. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, I think we established that pretty well. I think moving forward, open world has a lot of ground to cover more so than linear. Linear, I think, has been,
yeah,
covered pretty well up to this point in, the overall history of gaming. And we've seen such a huge surge in technological, performance over time in a lot of both types of games, really, linear and open world. I would
yeah,
argue open world has seen less innovation than linear. And the reason why that is, I just feel like you could do so much more with the linear based experience in regards to how the player is allowed to interact with that world.
hmm
Uh, a lot of examples of this include indie gaming. There's a lot of variety,
yeah,
and usually those are basically linear experiences. They have a story and they have, a limited gameplay loop that is fun to replay over and over. And then they usually have a story tied to it that's personal and can, you know, be felt empathetically by the player. And in open world games, I feel like there's a lot of times where the player having that essential freedom to do what they want, it kind of makes them wander away at times, which is fine. That's the point of an open world game. But I feel like in regards to its story, it's difficult to make the player go out and seek that more than the other activities in the open world.
yeah.
So I think that's one of the main strengths of linear is
Yeah,
it allows the story to, you know, like blossom and flourish before the
yeah.
player for them to absorb it in the most impactful way.
By far one of the biggest strengths. And so, okay, linear was popular for the longest time because it was all the technology could handle. I mean, you can't do an open world Sonic game like you can today. Now we have an open world Sonic game on the way. Um, it was all that was possible. And then like one of the very first goals of gaming was to invent open world games. N64's Mario 64 was this like first attempt at like, hey, the overworld is open world, and so it was. And with Spyro for PlayStation fans like myself, it was an attempt at, hey, this is what open worlds should look like. That was like the first hurdle for gaming, and now we're at the point now where we have Skyrim maps and we have even bigger, and so I feel like there are two different kinds of games coming out now. You can revisit linear, which is becoming very popular, and especially with indie developers because it's far cheaper to make a linear game. You could revisit linear, or you could try to reinvent open world. And I would say reinventing open world is very, very difficult because I've actually interviewed developers on both sides of this. And when I've developed the linear developers, it is 100% story and them showing you a moment. Really great example of this, RD Mars. Interviewed Ty Abbott, who's the director or the developer of that game, and there's a specific scene where when you go across the mirror, you see your personality on the mirror. It's basically your identities on the mirror. And if it was an open world game, it would be very hard to make sure that the player is looking at that mirror at that time. But on the other side of that, when I talked to DVSI about their upcoming games, and they're working on multiple open world games, their approach is far different. It's creating these mobs that are smart enough to actually challenge you and creating a world where it's like, we want to make this certain mountain, like actually making this like Archway Mountain, I thought was really cool. We want to make this certain mountain so cool that you are drawn to it naturally, and that's where the story will progress. And so I think that there's a level of like, for the developer, I think there's an easier route, not to say not as good, but an easier route and a harder route. And I appreciate the effort that both are putting into it, but I think the way that open world has to it's like I said before, it's a movie versus a game in a lot of ways, where like the linear games grab your face and say, look right there. While the open world is like, come check out this fancy castle. And you're like, all right, I'll go check it out. Oh, hey, look, there's a bad guy in here. And so, like with Elden Ring, with Elden Ring, man, you just got to playing that. There's that fancy castle that you're like, I don't know what I got to do, but I know I got to get to that place. And that's how you drive a game, an open world game. But linear's I will say that linear wins in pacing. There's no doubt. Like you've been mentioning, linear wins in pacing in that sense. If you're like, hey, we have 12 hours to tell the story, at the 2 hour mark, as long as the player's not dying for random reasons, or like me and Celeste all the time, then you're gonna hit this certain point, and we could keep going with the story. That's Act 1, Act 2. When an open world game, I've seen it countless times where people are just like, I really liked this starting area in Far Cry, so I just kind of hung out there for a little bit, 100%ed it before. We talked about this before in the past too, where you like sometimes you want 100% an area before you move to the next one. Well, that'll bog down a game a ton. So you're getting no new story beats. You're only hunting turkeys or something, and so you're not progressing the story at all. And the developer might not have wanted you to do that. The developer probably thought you'd go back to it or something like that. So you're kind of breaking the pacing the developer had anticipated. But I still feel like it's worth it because, yeah, but that's my game and I'm exploring it my way. So there's a little bit of a give and take. Like, I understand where you're coming from and you're right in that sense, but I also think it's a fair trade-off for the pacing. I don't know. It's a tough one. I think you might have won that
No,
one.
you touched on that well. For me, like for linear, that's a great argument for me. So I appreciate
Yeah.
that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I know. Yeah.
Uh, now that we're, kind of going into the player, I feel like we can kind of shift over now into the systems that we see between, the two different
Yeah.
types.
Yeah. Gameplay
And this
loops
can
too.
include
Yeah.
like technical, gameplay, graphics, all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So, for linear, I feel like the best argument you can make for a linear experience is to enhance, the graphic fidelity, and that can lead to animations for the characters and like facial animations as well. And, more so than ever, like voice acted dialogue is super important, as we've seen over the countless console generations, like from PS2 onward.
Oh yeah.
The impact of linear experiences has only grown, significantly. Like as we've seen with the Uncharted series or God of War, even with the 2018 edition.
Oh, such a good
Yeah,
game.
I'd argue God of War 2018 is a linear game.
I'd argue
And
it's a hybrid at best because
okay,
I would say the
this is
old
what I
God of
wanted.
Wars were, but I would say now it's kind of using an overworld system, which is it's we have to probably at some point describe that what that is. It's using an overworld system, but it's using a very nice one, and so it's creating an open world that puts you into linear stories. It's the Spyro model. It's the Mario 64 model. But I like if you're comparing it to it's specifically if you're comparing it to those early God of Wars, right? Those were fully linear. There was no open world at all.
Exactly. Yes.
So yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
What I love about God of War 2018 is the fact that it took those games and, as you mentioned, it was like a hybrid, but I think it was more of a linear experience, more so than an open world experience. And the reason for that, one of the games that I really want to discuss are immersive sims like BioShock
yeah,
or Prey or Dishonored. Now, I feel like those two are linear, but you have freedom of choice within each of the hubs in those distinct
right,
levels.
right, right.
And I feel like that's something linear does really well, because I don't see that working as fluidly in an open world game. Like I've seen countless times where, as you move from one area to another in an open world game, they use that as an excuse to change up like everything, like in regards to visuals or
Yeah,
enemies or that kind of stuff. And, as you progress in those, like I don't find them as memorable as I do in a linear experience.
really. You don't think like
I do.
discovering a new city? Like I love that in open world games when I have to go to a new city and I discover a new city and I'm like, oh, over here they worship the sun and they have metallic plating on their horses, unlike the place I was just at. So I feel like I'm discovering a new society every time I go to a new area in an open world game. A lot of times that happens with the vegetation. Oh, this place is snow based. There are some tropes. There's tropes in both of these arguments for sure,
True.
but
Yes.
I always enjoyed that about that. I feel like that's actually more natural in an open world game than it is in a linear game, because in a linear game you're like it's just level 2, but in an open world game you're like it's the next town over, which feels more natural storytelling wise.
And this is my point. I feel like with linear, it's more about world building and lore than open world because not only does the level design incorporate the universe that it's trying to set you in, but it's also about the sound and the lighting. And I'm thinking strictly about survival horror games. Like I
Yeah,
cannot see a survival horror open world game ever existing. And
yeah,
without that linear pinpoint, where you have to set the player to see specific things at specific times
yeah.
and challenge them to use their resources effectively. I feel like you can't replicate that in an open world style game.
I totally agree. Certain genres are just certain genres. You can't horror.
Yep.
Horror is setting up suspenseful moments. You can't set up a suspenseful moment every time. And but the same thing goes for like an MMORPG or something like that. That has to be open world game. Um, but I disagree on almost everything else you just said. So the fact that you're saying that
Good.
oh, it's all about showing off the world building, and I mean, what are you serious? Nobody does better with world building than open world games. When you're out there in I got a list of open world games that I'm not even using. Spider-Man. When you're in Spider-Man, you could feel the city breathing, the sounds of traffic, the mumbling about like, oh, did you hear this latest podcast? Because I love that they use podcast in it. Anyways, you feel that world breathing. That's creating a world. That's building a world more so than I would say like if I were to play Spider-Man on the PS2, which was like climb this building, now go to that specific building over there and do this. It's I feel like you're so limited in a linear game that they're having to force feed you some things, but like I promise you that this is what it's like in the world, but you can't see it. When an open world game is like, yeah, it's out in the world, it's over there, and you can go check it out if you want to. It's up to you. You don't have to, but you can. I mean, I think everybody who's played Spider Man, I can't believe you wouldn't. You had to have climbed Avengers Tower, and just checked it out up there. Have you done that? You,
I have personally.
you,
Yes, it was awesome.
yeah.
I
It's
agree.
it's dope as hell, man. You can't do that in a linear game. That kind of memory is only in an open world game, and the voice acting I think is a place of innovation in open world games. Going back to Horizon Forbidden West, she whispers to herself when she's like, but it's her natural thought process, but it's actually helping out the player where she's like, oh, I think this flower might be useful for Jacob. And then you're like, oh, that's right, I got a quest where I got to bring Jacob some flowers. But she's like whispering to herself like you would naturally talk to yourself, and you're like, oh, I think I need milk at the house. That kind of thing. And that kind of innovation is something that you wouldn't need in a single player game because you're just like, oh, you're just saying your lines. Here's a script. When like if you looked at like the dialogue script in a linear and an open world game, I mean they're vastly different. In a linear game, it's literally a movie script. You just got to say these lines in this order. But in an open world game, you need to have triggers. It's a if then all the way through. So if you are near a fire, then you might say, oh, finally I'm warming up. It's so cold out here. Like I just love that idea because then I know if I go towards a fire, it's beneficial to my character. That's something I'm learning other than just be like, oh, okay, this is the bad guy. I got to beat him up at some point. I don't know. I feel like linear games are limited in world building, and I would also say in voiceover work. It's good in linear games. Don't be wrong, but it's limited pretty harshly. I mean,
I'd say it
yeah.
really drastically depends on, the company making the game.
Oh, of
Like we've
course.
seen a lot of open world games, and this was during like the 360 PS3 era
Mm-hmm.
where there were a lot of open worlds that were copy paste and
Definitely.
the NPCs in particular offered really basic repetitive missions. Like I always
Yeah.
think of the Assassin's Creed series as the forefront of this.
Yep. Yep.
And over time we've seen that continue to rely on the same formula basically.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's one of the main drawbacks of open world. You don't really see that too often in open world games where there's a lot of investment in the player, the how the player progresses in the game. You go to an NPC, you
Yeah.
get a request, you collect something, and with linear, I feel like there's more dynamic decision making happening with the player, whereas with open world, you're kind of automatically going through the motions.
I
And
disagree. Decision making in a linear game is not made by the player. It's made to look like it's made by the player. Just like when
mm,
you do like a Telltale game and you have your dialogue options. There's 5 endings, folks. You can play that game over and over again all you want. You're gonna get one of 5 endings. It's not like you're gonna magically create a new one. But an open world game has that choice that you're seeking in a linear game. I just think I don't agree with you on that. I think the linear game is limited in that way. You're too linear. You're on a rail. We're calling them linear games, but I think amongst gamers, I think we also often call it games on rails because that's what it is, right? You're stuck on a rail, and you literally don't have the option to leave the rail because otherwise you can't. You just Crash Bandicoot. It's speaking of innovation. Talk about Crash Bandicoot. The game's been out for 20 something years. Great game, good fun play. It's the same damn game from the first one to whatever we're on now, Insane or whatever. It's the same thing. You're going, you spin to crush boxes, blah 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 blah. Fun, beautiful, more so than now than ever. But I'm still playing the same game. But if you look at like Assassin's Creed's a great example. The first game was one of the first examples of like going from a city to city and doing something different, and each city feeling different. Compared to now, when you're looking at like Valhalla, which has got this whole exploration idea of like, hey, I can actually conquer this little thing. I can take over this. I think the limitation, you're just so limited in linear. I think it hurts the player experience really.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, I think you bring up some good points as well there. With linear experiences, it is a feeling of like you're confined in the role that the developer put you in, basically, and you have to experience what they wish you to see. But I would also argue because of that, it allows the developer to have more creativity and also to express what they wish to with their story or their world or their gameplay. And with open world, I feel like that's more incentivized to drain resources from the player. And what I mean by that is now we're seeing things like time saver packs in open world games.
Oh, fair.
And there's an
Ooh.
incentivization to, have a cash shop or
Yeah.
stuff like that. And, cosmetics and all that stuff. But with a linear experience, it's usually all contained within the game itself at no additional pricing. So
Yeah.
I push that to you as well.
Well, okay, but that's yeah, okay. Fair.
I
Let's
had to
start
get
off
that
with
one
that.
in at least.
Let's just at least say okay, that's fair. But I will say that's because development. There's two costs to worry about: development cost and player cost. So development cost on an open world game far outpaces the development time of a linear game, right? Because you don't have to build the world, like but so it's a lot cheaper. So that's why you can make a lot more indie games that are linear. Um, anyway, so yeah, it's a set price, and then the bonuses you don't usually have to pay for. There's not a lot of skins you have to buy. Open world games will have more skins and more DLCs because the game costs a lot more to make, and that's why there'll be those DLCs that'll extend the original game more so because it saves them money. They could still tell more story, but they don't have to build new rigging. Like the character is still the character; they just have different clothes now. That's that. Player time or player cost is their time. So yes, 12 hours in a linear game is perfect. 19 hours is kind of pushing it, but I think that's what God of War was. Is 19 hours, 2018 version. Um, but if you're looking at an open world game, player time is much bigger. Yeah, I mean we all know Skyrim was pitched with 200 hours of gameplay, and for a lot of people that was a selling point. For others, that was the reason they didn't touch it. Going into an open world game, I feel like they're generally, especially now, like there was a point where we were just like pushing the open world aspect of it so hard. Like we were talking about that, like you were talking about with that Xbox 360 PS3 era, when it was like, oh, hey, this open world's cool. Where we were just like, let's add as many hours as possible and force the player to play those. Now in an open world game, you could do the story missions without doing any of the side missions and make it a 12 to 20 hour game. It's just that you have to have a little more focus to make sure that you stick to that mission. And the extra stuff's out there for anybody who wants it. Again, with the Horizon Forbidden West story, you could go just story mode. You could totally do that. You could just go to the story beats and make that game quite short. I didn't. I played all the side stuff, and it's a 60-plus hour game for me now.
All right, so you say player investment, you can have the player devote less of their time, just play through the story. But I would argue again, like that's a linear experience because you're going through just the story, and that's where the developer is sitting you down and they're saying, okay, pay attention to this story that we crafted in this open world. So I would argue you have linear experiences within open world games. And again, like that speaks to the strength of storytelling a narrative in gaming in general.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a linear aspect of the open world game, but That's your prerogative. I'm saying it gives you the option, and that option is in there. But there is almost no option to do any open world exploring or expanding your world or expanding your game or expanding your experience in a linear game. You only have one option. You're on the track. But in an open world game, you have that option. Kate, it's like, oh, here it is. Oh boy. Okay, watch out. Frank's got a great metaphor here. So while linear games are on a track where you can't leave, open world games have a road. Can you go off roading? Hell yeah, and it's a lot of fun. But you don't need to. You could stay on that road and get to your same destination at the same time as somebody who's on the track. It's just that you have the option to turn on 4-wheel drive and head out there. That's what I'm saying. Open world game gives you what you want in linear. It's just that they're better at it. you know. What?
Well, it's like a trip to the store. You know what you want with the linear game. You go in there, you
Yeah.
pick up what you don't want, and then you leave, and then you're done.
Yeah, but then you don't go home with those nice new chips, or maybe Lay's put out this like new zany flavor. You got to try it out. What are you gonna do? You know how many different Oreos there are now? you gotta grab some crazy ass Oreos, man. Um, what tropes do you think a linear game does well that can never be repeated in an open world game,
What linear does well.
or linear does poorly and you wish they could do better? Because I'll just give you a quick example for open world
I'm
game.
not falling for your trap. I'm sticking for linear.
All right, all right. This is a trap here. Trap card. Yeah, magic. Or no. Oh God, Yu-Gi-Oh. Sorry, don't hit me. So yeah, in open world games, it drives me bananas, but I know it just kind of has to exist. Or whenever there's some sort of like paint or Far Cry is a great example because they'll have like these like ropes hanging of places where you can climb on mountains. You know what I'm saying? And then in a lot of other games, it's kind of like, oh well, that for some reason every time a rock I could climb on has a sheer face on it, and all the rocks face downward for some random ass reason. It's like I get it, guys. I'm playing Kena Bridge of Spirits, fantastic game, awesome game, and it's a perfect example of hybrid open world linear game. It's actually I would say the best example of it I've seen. But every time it's a place to climb, it's got paint that randomly fell and spilt on it. It's like that takes me out of the game. And so it's at which, oh boy, here we go. Here's that trap card. It's a linear aspect inserted in my open world game. Dropping my pen, guys. That was perfect. What about you? What's some tropes in single player games or linear games?
You know, one of the things that is really difficult to deal with in linear is things that don't enhance the quality of the experience.
Yeah.
And we were discussing QuickTime events much earlier before recording.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that is a drawback to the linear experience because it limits the player to forcing out the developer's will. And yes, that I did fall for your trap card. That is one drawback.
Why do you think linear? Why do you think QuickTime events exist?
I think it's to kind of give player control within a cutscene for a narrative story element. And games like Resident Evil 4 did this really well, where you could actually die from failing that QuickTime event.
Yeah.
But of course, as we've seen over the course of history with gaming, QuickTime events, games like Heavy Rain or Beyond Two Souls incorporated QuickTime events strictly as the only gameplay you get in the game. And I would argue it didn't help anything.
Yeah. I think
All
LA
the David
Noir was a
Cage
game
games.
like that. Where it was like the entire game was just basically quick times. And I'm like, okay, well, great story.
Right.
I'll watch it on HBO next time.
See, I think LA Noir is a really good game to talk about for this specific topic because it's an open world game, but its story is so linear. And the open world merely exists as a backdrop for the gameplay because you can't really do anything in the open world. You can't really
Yeah.
interact with anything. All you can do is like collect, I think, these audio reels or something or
Mhm.
badges. I can't remember now.
It's been too long.
But the gameplay, that could have been a story-driven game without an open world, and it would have probably been better for it, in my opinion.
It feels like it should have been a Telltale more than anything else, Um, yeah, that leans into this idea of hybrid worlds. So where we're seeing that with like Halo 3 was one of the first games I realized was a hybrid, where it's like, oh, I'm actually on rails, but the rails are so wide that it feels like it's kind of open world right now. Kenya's got that. It's kind of this, oh, Halo Infinite. Here's one that everybody's played. Halo Infinite is exactly that. It's open world, and yes, I've done a lot of exploring, but I mean, you are literally going from one underground bunker to another underground bunker. They give you the open world. It's an overworld in a lot of ways, and then you realize that you're just going from one place, and then all of a sudden you go down underneath, and it's like, oh, I'm playing another Halo game. Like this is actually a normal Halo game in here.
Mm.
It's just that I used an open world to get across. So like, it was a hybrid, and I really think that Halo Infinite's the best example of what we could see from both of our sides. Because when I'm in those underground bunkers, there is definitely moments where it's like, hey, come check out this cool thing. This is where it's at. But then when I'm in the overworld, I'm like, oh, there's a base of Covenant up here that I'm going to try to attack this way or that way. It's my option because it's open world and I can do whatever I want. And then one of the key aspects, and I think it's something that your faction just doesn't have a chance, buddy, is traversal. It can be done wrong, and it's done wrong often. But Spider-Man, when you're swinging around in that city, Halo Infinite, when you're grappling over rocks and trying to fling yourself as fast as you can. Red Dead Redemption, you on your horse, and you know how emotionally invested you were in that horse. When it dies at the end, like you're like, no, who cares about anything else right now? You're trying to save people, but you're really just trying to res your horse. Um, Traversal is something that it's a gameplay feature that's in open world games that I can't see. Maybe Bioshock Infinite, because Bioshock Infinite is kind of a hybrid as well in a lot of ways, but it's more linear than anything else. Has a good traversal
Yeah.
with the hook. What do you think? Is there?
Oh,
Can you think of a good example of that?
BioShock is curious to me. Like
Yeah,
Ken Levine made the first BioShock, and he had these hub-based levels,
yeah, yeah.
and
Great.
there's a
Yeah.
lot of freedom to traverse these areas in whatever way you want. And then we get BioShock Infinite. It is strictly linear, and
Well,
the
I would say
story
it's
takes center
linear,
stage.
but it feels open world. It's like what I was saying earlier.
I disagree. No,
Really?
it's not. I do.
Oh
Yeah.
wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, BioShock Infinite, I haven't even replayed because it's strictly on rails. And it does feel like it's a
That's
big
fair.
open world, but the basic gameplay loop is you go to an area and you have a set number of enemies to defeat. And then you move on and you kind of have Elizabeth time where you're,
Yeah.
you know, listening to her dialogue and her interacting with the world. And this is what I mean by, linear based experiences are like theme park rides.
Yeah.
BioShock Infinite is a theme park ride,
You're
like
right.
bar
You're
none.
right. Yeah, you've convinced me. Actually, yeah, it is far more linear than I remembered before. But there were a lot of those moments where it's like, this is what France looked like in the '40s, or like they would like specifically show you a moment. That's true. God, I love those Bioshock games. By the way, guys, it will be too late. No, this is the day. It's free on Epic Store. The day this comes out, the last day it's free. So, guys, all three games are free on the Epic Store, and all three are worth playing, in my opinion. That twist at the end of Bioshock Infinite, man, had me shook so hard. Oh my god, what a cool game! But you're right. I've replayed Bioshock One, but I haven't replayed Bioshock Infinite. That's interesting, and I wonder what the basis of that is. I wonder why that's the case.
All right, so I did fall for your trap card where I admitted that BioShock Infinite being a linear game made it worse than BioShock.
Ha ha! I didn't
So,
realize I put that card down. But yeah. Um,
but now I want to flip it on you
okay.
because all those open world games you mentioned before, Halo Infinite, and I can't remember the other two now.
Spider-Man and Red Dead
Red
Redemption,
Dead Redemption
all
and Spider
traversal
Man.
games. Yeah.
They were originally linear games where we had Halo 1 through 3, I guess, where it was a linear, focused action, good pacings for the story.
Mm-hmm.
Red Dead Revolver was mission based,
Yeah.
and this came out before Red Dead Redemption 1.
Yeah.
And, it was basically like a theme park shootout.
Yeah. It was. Yeah.
Those type of carnival games where you have a gun and you like an airsoft rifle and you
Oh
have to
yeah.
shoot at
That
the
was a
targets.
classic. Yeah. Yep.
That's Red Dead Revolver, basically.
Yeah.
And then for the last one, Spider Man, we had so many Spider games over the years,
Yeah.
but
Activision
that
went crazy with
original
that.
Spider Man 2 was, it was kind of like in a city.
Mm-hmm.
It was mission based as well, but the city was like the level. And your objectives as Spider Man was to do something within that level, but you still had the freedom of swinging whichever way you want.
Yeah.
So
Okay. All right.
there we go.
Here's my. You got your trap card. Here's my instance card. Uh, were those games made better by becoming open world games?
I would argue I haven't played Infinite, so I can't speak to that one.
Okay.
But Spider Man, yes.
Yeah.
clearly, Spider-Man, yes.
I'm ready to play it again right now, man. Just talking about it.
Like for real, like Spider-Man is one of the best open world games
It's so
ever,
good.
like
Miles
bar
Morales
none.
too, and they're coming to PC. I think I mentioned that earlier, but yeah, they are coming to PC. So yeah.
And of course, Red Dead Redemption, hell yeah, it was made better. Yeah.
Aha. So games are made better when open world games. Can you think? Okay, so can you think of an open world game that would be better in a linear
See,
fashion?
that's the cookie. You can't really go back from open world and
Yeah.
devolve, essentially.
Devolve. You just said it. You
I
just
did.
said it.
I did.
I think you just lost 20 health. What game are we playing? I think that's Hearthstone.
Ouch. Yeah, that
Oh
was
man.
a face hit for sure.
Oh man. I there are many linear games that I wish were open world games. I mean, I'm thinking of Hades. Like, how cool would it be to explore Hades that way and actually explore the different levels and see those bosses in an open world? I would love to see that. Hey, maybe someday when they get the funding and evolve. Um, but as for games that could go linear, maybe a version, a spin-off, we'll say, of like a Horizon or a Breath
I
of the
was thinking,
Wilds would be good.
one of the open world games that I just can't stand playing anymore is Far Cry. And the reason why is because the open world just gets in the
Yeah.
way, I feel
Okay.
like. And with Far Cry, all you're really doing is the same three activities.
Yeah.
You're clearing out a settlement, you're gathering resources, or you're doing a story mission. And that's
Yeah.
basically it.
It really is. Yeah.
And everything in between is just you traversing the open world. I would argue Far Cry would make for a far better linear experience than
I
an open world experience.
I could see that. That's not a bad idea, really. It's I actually do like my favorite part of those three is when I get to clear out bases. I like doing that because like a lot of Ghost Recon nowadays, you could choose how you do it, and I love that. Like I want to go stealth this time. Um, but you're right. A linear version of that game would be good. I don't know if it'd be better. One of the big downsides is that traversal in Far Cry, which I think is a make or break in a lot of open world games, traversal in Far Cry can be hampering. That's a problem with the company overall though, because it could also be that case for Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed, if you guys remember, like 2 and 3, uh, a lot of times they were just like you're in a new city now. Like a lot of times you like get in a boat and all of a sudden you're in Florence, Italy instead. And so they didn't really want you to, or for some reason, by chance, Rome and Florence happen to be next to each other in this world where traversal is minimal as can be. Other games have gone the other way with that, but yeah, there's an argument for Far Cry. I can see that, and there is actually a linear version of Assassin's Creed, with Assassin's Creed China and Russia, and there's one other I can't remember.
Oh, right. Yeah,
They're
and
very
India.
different. India, there we go. They're very
Yeah.
different, but I like them. They're fun to play. They're not my favorite version of the games, but they're fun to play. I always think of I'm seeing now that if open world's going to go to linear, then it's a spin-off or like a gimmick more so.
That's usually the case. Yeah, we see
Yeah,
that all too often. Like I know there's been a lot of spin-offs for a variety of franchises
yeah,
that, take a basic gameplay loop and make that to a side scroller
yeah,
or just a straight up like mission select style game. And it's really difficult to go back once you've gone to open world.
yeah,
And I would argue, like, what's next after that? Like, what's after open world?
yeah. Well, I mean VR, right? So I think VR is probably the pinnacle of open world until I get my holodeck. Fingers crossed. But yeah, I would say that yeah, there's a level of that's out there where you could be as immersed and explore as much as you want as if you were in real life. I think that's the best case scenario. Um, one more to toss into open world games that should be linear. Borderlands. Borderlands would be a better game overall, I think, as a linear game.
I can see that. Like, I really love Tales of the Borderlands,
Yeah,
and that was a Telltale game, and you basically just had dialogue, but you
yeah,
know, it does work like as a different type of Borderlands experience where no shooting is involved and no vehicle traversal.
yeah.
But yeah, I can see that.
So with open world games, like I said, finding a new way to immerse the player, a better way to immerse the player, I think is beneficial. I think we're getting really good. And one of the things we've been doing recently, as I'm sure you know, we've been reducing the HUD as much as possible. There are some now where the HUD doesn't exist until you need it. I think that's another level of immersion. What about on Rails? How do you evolve outside of just making an open world game? How do you make on Rails better?
I feel like we've seen that already. We have immersive sims that have hub based levels, and that branches out the linear design even further
Yeah,
without, classifying it as open world where you need to traverse all the way to the opposite side of the map to progress the story.
yeah,
But I guess now that I've said that, that is kind of true for linear as well, but in a much narrower way.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
Like I think immersive sims in general though are the biggest linear games can be.
yeah, they're very good too. I can't suggest. Have you tried Kenna Bridge of Spirits yet?
I have not.
I really suggest that game. First off, I didn't expect it, but it's got a Metroidvania feel to it, where it's very light, but like you get a new ability, and all of a sudden, like, oh, I can explore this area I didn't know I could explore before. Um, it's a really good game that I think gives us both the right answers. It's got these moments where it's like, hey, this is the shot I want you to see, and it makes you see it, and it does have a very linear story, like, and it's a hub based too. There's 4 masks you're collecting, and each mask has their own story that's phenomenal. Um, and I'm halfway beating that game, and I'm enjoying every moment of it. But it also has an open world thing where I'm like, let me go check out what's over here, and I've taken time to climb something I'm not necessarily supposed to climb just to see what's up there. But knowing, even when I'm doing that though, I do know I'm on rails. Like I know that I'm just looking at a spot for a different angle. It's not like say Horizon where I've climbed rocks just so that I could get a good picture for my Twitter account. you know, um, but I would say Kenna is one of those examples where we're both right. Can you think of any other games where both of us are satisfied 100%?
Well, we did talk about God of War already,
God of War is
and
good, yeah, and
I would
Bioshock
say that's a really good one.
or not Bioshock,
BioShock Infinite, I would
not that one.
disagree. I
I meant
think
Halo Infinite is
that's
what I meant.
linear.
Sorry, yeah, Halo
Oh,
Infinite.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I still need to play that one.
yeah.
Um, Aside from those, I think another great one would probably be Elden Ring because you do have
Yes,
linear based like castles that you have to take one path through to get to the boss to defeat, while still having a semblance of an open world outside of that. And,
yeah.
I can gush about Elden Ring for hours if I
Well,
really
I
wanted to,
think
but I won't.
so. Elden Ring, when it's an open world, and okay, so with Elden Ring, is there any rhyme or reason to like this area bosses are at this level and that area bosses are at that level? Does that exist in that game?
Basically, yeah,
Okay.
there are like similarities between open world tropes being incorporated into Elden Ring
Yeah.
and the typical Souls franchise design. So if you see a big giant castle or monument or something, that's a very significant place for either a boss or story related
Yeah.
like mission.
Open world trope. Yep. yeah.
Yep. And with the rest of the world, it's more muted, and there's still a lot of enemy variety. Not so much in Elden Ring, but I mean just in general. Like you'll have similar repeating patterns of, oh, hey, here's a cave. There's going to be a boss at the end of it,
Yeah.
and you do that over and over and over again. That's basically the limit of open world. I feel like there's just a lot of copy paste elements in
There
open world
is.
design.
Yeah. Yeah. But
And for linear, I would just say, there's more variety overall.
well, I mean, there are tropes for linear as well. You got your platforming. You've got your double jump now works, so I can get onto new things. You have a ranged attack. I mean, there's tropes that really transcend both of the genres. But um,
Yes.
I would say, do we have a winner? That's what I'm wondering right now. Do we have a winner out of the two of us?
Well, let me ask. I was gonna, bookend this. So
Yeah,
at the beginning, I asked you what your favorite open world and my favorite linear was. Now we're gonna do the opposite.
I like that. Yeah,
So for me, I'll start off. My favorite open world games include Spider-Man,
yeah,
God of War. I guess you can classify it as open world, but I'd say it's more of a hybrid.
yeah.
I love Metal Gear Solid 5 for what it did, but I
Ooh,
felt
that's a
like,
good one.
that was more mission based than true open world.
Hmm.
And then, of course, open world RPGs like Fallout, New Vegas.
Okay, Fallout New Vegas. Yeah. Um, okay, so my favorite linears, Bioshock, And I specifically, one of my favorite things in that game is in the first one when you're going through one of the tunnels, these glass tubes underwater, and you look over and you see another one that has a big daddy and a little sister in it, and you're just like, thank God for this tube. Like, they did such a good job. I love how the sound design of that game, where you hear that and it just starts shaking. You're like, I don't know how I'm gonna win this. We'll see. Um, Call of Duty games are some of the best, and I made sure not to mention it because I can't win that fight. Call of Duty games are one of the best linear games I can think of, especially back when they used to do them right with like Modern Warfare and all. Because you're literally building an entire set. Like if it was an open world game, but you're leading this linear path on it, and I'm exploring the entire world that I'm in with this linear path, and you realize like, yeah, I'm going through a neighborhood right now, and really there's only one road, but that road goes into people's backyards, to this person's house, and it makes you explore, and it feels cool, but it's very linear. And I love Call of Duty games. Every Call of Duty game's opening scene is some of the best gaming has to offer. That's why when they tried to do Black Ops 3 and it was no campaign, I was like, you guys just done botched it. And they realized that. Now they all have campaigns. But those are my two. And Tomb Raider is always a solid linear game as well. But really, those first two are like I gotta give it to linear games. Sometimes they just nail it. Yeah.
For my open world games, what I enjoy most about them is the freedom of choice. Like for Metal Gear Solid 5, the gameplay was so good in that game.
Yeah.
And I'd argue the open world was a huge detriment to that game. But with the way Kojima was going, it made sense with Death Stranding, which, I did not like as much. But
Mm-hmm.
with Metal Gear Solid 5, the gameplay was just perfect. Like controlling the character was just bar none one of the best gameplay experiences I've ever had.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the open world did not meet the same level as the gameplay. And I'd argue that's why I enjoy linear more, because I feel like with the crafted world and the set level design and your character on rails, as you mentioned, you can go through that in a much shorter time period
Yeah.
and it's more memorable. With open world, I don't feel like it's as memorable of like gaming moments. Like I don't remember them as
Yeah.
fondly as I do as the big story beats and linear narrative driven experiences.
All right. For the sake of us running out of time, I won't argue that one. I'll give you that one. I could argue it though, for part two, guys. No. Okay, that's
Maybe
fair.
with
That's
Kevin.
fair. Yeah,
We'll
I
see.
get. I wonder which Kevin would side with you. What am I even saying? I know
I
Kevin would
know
side
it's
with me.
2 versus 1 in that case.
Yeah, I'm glad he's taking the break. God, ganging up on me. All right, who do you think won this then? Is there a
Oh
winner, or should we?
Jesus.
No, no, no. Wait. Let's
Let the
let's not do
audience
that. Let's the
decide.
audience do it. You're right. You're right. Yeah, it's the
Yes, the
audience.
poll. The poll.
Guys, when this episode comes out, go to our Twitter account, follow us, first of all. Second, vote on who won, open world or Rails, where you're limited. I'm throwing
Linear.
that out there.
Linear.
Linear. Rails. Thank you guys very much for joining us, though. Yeah.
And of course, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We need them. It helps us grow
Yep.
and give you more content and deliver what you guys want. And also, yeah, leave us feedback, leave comments, let us know how you feel, not just about the podcast, but about the topics we discuss. We
Yep.
love all sorts of feedback. We have a great Discord community you can share your thoughts in. Links are all in the description below.
Yeah. We also have a brand new podcast that launched this week. Check that out. It's called Headlines. It's got yours truly in it, and it comes out every single day. So check it out.
What's headlines?
Headlines is just the headlines in under 5 minutes. It's a microcast. And so you get the basic headlines for every day under 5 minutes. And it's essentially, so I make the TikToks. It's essentially the audio from the TikToks, but combined into one chunk in podcast form. So yeah, you'll catch up on the main things.
Headlines in general, or headlines like
The
for a
ga-
specific type of topic?
gaming, there are normal Geek Freaks headlines. So they're like Geek
Got
Freaks.
it.
So
Okay.
yeah, video games, comic books, TVs, and movies. Yeah. Check it
Perfect.
out. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, as always a pleasure. Thank you, Frank, for joining and filling in for Kevin today.
Thank you for having me, of course.
Absolutely. And I guess that's it for us. Thanks again. And until next time, love you.
See you guys.